The flood was over, yet the ark remained shut. Beneath it lay a washed mountain and a world without a village, field, market, or neighboring fire. 8 people had survived God's judgment, but survival had not yet become a human world. That was the burden waiting beyond the door. Noah had watched the waters retreat by degrees. First, a raven went out, moving over a surface that still gave it nowhere to rest. Then the dove returned. A second flight brought back an olive leaf. By the third flight, the dove did not return at all. The earth was becoming inhabitable before its survivors were allowed to enter it. In the 601st year of Noah's life, the covering was removed. He could see dry ground. Still, he did not force the door. The command to leave came from God. Noah, his wife, his sons and their wives, along with every creature that had entered, were to go out and multiply upon the earth. That detail changes the first morning after the flood. Noah did not step out as an explorer claiming empty land. He stepped out as a servant released by the same voice that had ordered the ark built. The ground was open, but its future was not his to define alone. The animals came out by their kinds. The language is deliberate and broad. Birds, livestock, creeping things, every living creature. What had been gathered into one vessel began separating again across an emptied earth. Life was being returned to its places, each creature carrying a future it could not yet see. Noah's household had no city to repair. There were no streets full of survivors from another camp. Every later household in Genesis would trace its earthly beginning through this small company. The first inheritance after the flood was not prosperity. It was a silence large enough to make every decision matter. Ararat is named as the resting place of the ark, yet Scripture gives no tour of the landscape beyond it. That restraint keeps attention on the people and the command. Mountains can preserve a vessel. They cannot teach a family how to live once the vessel is behind them. The closed door had kept judgment out and life in. When it opened, it did not release a finished civilization. It released a family into responsibility. Children would be born, food would be gathered, land would be claimed, and memory would either become reverence or fade into a story told without obedience. The first thing built outside the ark would reveal which memory Noah carried with him. Before a house, before a vineyard, before a boundary line, he built an altar. Noah took from the clean animals and clean birds and offered burnt offerings on that altar. The creatures had been preserved in pairs and sevens through a catastrophe that had erased the old human order. Their first use outside the ark was not profit, labor, or possession. It was worship. The offering rose from ground, still marked by the flood. Genesis describes the Lord receiving a pleasing aroma and speaking a resolve concerning the earth. Human evil had not disappeared. The judgment had shown its reach. Yet the promise that followed established a different horizon for every generation after Noah. God said that he would not again curse the ground because of man, though the inclination of the human heart remained evil from youth. He would not again strike down every living thing as he had done. Seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night would continue. Those words gave the survivors something practical as well as holy. A farmer could plant without believing every cloud carried the end of the world. Parents could raise children under seasons that would return. The rhythm of ordinary life became a mercy granted by God, not a machine that humanity could command. The covenant widened beyond Noah. It was made with his descendants and with every living creature that had come out of the ark, birds, cattle, beasts, and all flesh. The future of the earth was not entrusted to one family's skill. It rested first on God's determination to preserve creation. The sign was a bow set in the cloud. A bow can be seen only when rain and light meet, which made the sign fit the world that had just endured water from above and below. Whenever clouds gathered, the sign would stand in the very place where fear might have risen fastest. The covenant did not claim that human beings had become harmless. It named God's restraint in a world where sin remained real. The rainbow therefore belonged to the whole earth, including people who would never know Noah's name. Mercy was made public before nations, languages, and borders existed. Noah's altar gave the new world its first center. The bow gave it a promise overhead. Between the two stood a question every generation would inherit. What kind of life can grow beneath mercy without treating mercy as permission to forget the one who gave it? The answer moved quickly from the sky to the table. God blessed Noah and his sons and told them to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. The command carried the same broad purpose heard at creation, but it now entered a world that had seen violence take creation to the edge. Fear and dread of humanity would fall upon the animals. Every moving thing that lived could serve as food, just as the green plants had been given before. The sentence recognizes a changed human relationship with the creatures around them. Hunting, herding, slaughter, and eating would enter the daily order openly. Yet permission came with a boundary. Flesh could be eaten, but not with its lifeblood still in it. Blood marked life as belonging under God's authority. A meal could sustain a household, but it could never teach that life was cheap or fully owned by the hand that took it. This was a world of need. Families would have to feed children through hard seasons. Animals would be used for labor and food. Genesis does not hide that reality behind a gentle picture of untouched fields. It places restraint inside necessity, so power over creatures would remain answerable to the giver of life. The rule about blood also prepared the ground for a greater command. If animal blood carried the weight of life, human blood could not be handled as one more resource in a rebuilding world. The old earth had become full of violence. The new earth would receive a boundary meant to confront it at its source. God declared that he would require an accounting for human lifeblood. He would require it from animals and from human beings, from the hand of every man's brother. The language makes murder a breach that cannot be hidden inside a tribe, a household, a battle, or a private grievance. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. Genesis says, for in the image of God he made man. Genesis chapter 9, verse 6. The claim reaches beneath law, custom, and rank. A human life bears a dignity granted by God before any ruler calls it valuable. The phrase, every man's brother, matters in a family about to become nations. Violence often begins by turning another person into a stranger, a rival, or a burden. This command names the victim as kin. The murderer may deny the bond, yet God's accounting begins from it. Before the flood, the earth had been filled with violence. After the flood, the first public moral boundary concerned violence again. The problem was not ignorance. The survivors knew what a world organized by violence had produced. Their descendants would carry that memory in the very terms of their social life. God repeated the charge to be fruitful and multiply, to bring forth abundantly on the earth. Filling the earth was not a vague wish. It was part of the order given to humanity after judgment. Land, family, food, blood, and justice all belonged together in the work of rebuilding. Noah's household had received covenant mercy, a sign in the clouds, food with restraint, and a command guarding human life. None of those gifts could force faithfulness inside a tent. The first fracture after the flood would come from no army beyond the horizon. It would come from the family itself. Noah became a man of the soil and planted a vineyard. This is the first named work assigned to him after the ark. He had built the vessel that outlived the world. Then he put roots into ground that needed patient care. A vineyard promised future harvest, but it also introduced wine. He drank of the wine and became drunk. Inside his tent, he lay uncovered. Genesis tells the event with no ornament and no attempt to turn Noah into a flawless patriarch. The man who obeyed through the flood could still fall into a humiliating vulnerability after it. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father's nakedness and told his two brothers outside. The account gives no long explanation of his act, but it places his response against theirs with unusual care. He carried the exposure outward. He made the private shame of the tent into speech. Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on their shoulders, and walked backward into the tent. Their faces were turned away. They covered their father without looking at him. Their movement is slow in the telling, as though restraint had to be shown step by step before its meaning could be understood. When Noah awoke and learned what his younger son had done to him, he spoke a curse concerning Canaan and blessings over Shem and Japheth. The wording has troubled readers for centuries because Ham acts while Canaan is named in the pronouncement. Genesis preserves the scene without expanding its legal explanation. Later readers have built claims about race and slavery from this episode. Those claims violate the story's own boundaries. Canaan is named as the ancestor of particular Canaanite peoples in Genesis, and the passage never authorizes a curse upon every descendant of Ham or a hierarchy of human worth. The judgment outside the ark had ended, but the disorder of the human heart had crossed the threshold with the survivors. The first danger in the second world was not a rising sea. It was dishonor within the family charged with carrying God's commands into every land. The contrast between the brothers remained. Ham turned his father's exposure into an outward report. Shem and Japheth treated the same exposure as a burden to cover. The family would never again be merely 8 people gathered around an ark. Its choices were already becoming the moral inheritance of lines yet unborn. Noah lived 350 years after the flood, 950 years in all. His long life stretched across the beginning of the nations that would descend from his sons. A survivor of the old world remained present while the new one spread beyond the mountain. Shem, Ham, and Japheth are introduced as brothers, but Genesis soon follows their names into different houses and regions. The blessing spoken over the God of Shem points beyond a private compliment. It sets one line within a future in which the knowledge of God will travel through generations. Japheth is blessed with enlargement and with dwelling in the tents of Shem. Ham is identified again as the father of Canaan. The language is compact, yet the names become frames for later history. Genesis is beginning to map kinship before it maps land. The family fracture never becomes an excuse to imagine 3 separate human origins. All the nations in the coming table share the same post-flood household. Their distinctions grow out of one family, which means the spread of peoples carries both a common human bond and memories of conflict. The ancient world did not divide itself according to modern categories. Genesis speaks through fathers, sons, clans, lands, languages, and nations. Its genealogy is not a census of every people who ever lived. It is a theological map, tracing the peoples known within the horizon of Israel's world. Noah's long life placed a survivor of the old world beside the beginning of the nations that would descend from his sons. Yet Genesis gives him no throne and no capital named for him. His authority appears in blessing, warning, labor, and the painful words spoken after the vineyard. The second world begins without a human emperor at its center. The sons had left the ark with wives, animals, and a command to multiply. Every birth enlarged the household's needs. Every marriage created new loyalties. Every move away from the mountain turned memory into a choice rather than an inheritance held in common. The future had to be built in ordinary decisions long before it appeared in cities. Shem is named first in the genealogy that follows, though Genesis orders the brothers according to the subject at hand. The book does not use the names as labels for fixed modern populations. It follows lines of descent because later promises and conflicts unfold through families whose roots must be understood. Ham's line is introduced through Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. Those names point toward regions south and west of Israel's world, including Egypt and Canaan. The genealogy refuses the fiction that later enemies appeared without kinship. They too stand within the family that emerged from the ark. Japheth's descendants lead toward lands often associated with the north and the coastlands. Their placement expands the horizon beyond the immediate landscape of Genesis. The earth is being filled in more than one direction, which makes Babel's attempt to bind humanity to a single center more clearly opposed to the command. The blessing over Shem names the Lord as Shem's God. It does not turn God into a tribal possession. It marks a line through which the knowledge of the Lord and the promise to bless the nations will later be carried. The words spoken in one tent begin reaching toward a future far beyond it. Noah's words over Japheth speak of enlargement. Enlargement can mean land, descendants, and room to spread. The image of dwelling in Shem's tents remains suggestive rather than mechanically explained. Genesis gives the blessing a direction, then allows later history to reveal the complex ways those lines will meet. The sons are not moral symbols floating above history. They are fathers. Their households will settle territory, exchange goods, wage war, worship, and form languages. The family scene in the tent matters because a wounded household becomes the root system beneath an expanding human world. When Genesis turns to the table of nations, it slows the story by design. Names can feel distant until their function comes into view. Each one says that people who later appear as a collective nation began as relatives, attached to places, occupations, and memories that took generations to form. The genealogies preserve a world before national borders had the shape familiar to later readers. A name may indicate an ancestor, a clan, a territory, or a people associated with that ancestor. The text moves among these senses because ancient identity was carried through households that became communities. Gomer and Javan appear in Japheth's line. Their descendants include names connected with maritime movement and island settlements. The story of the post-flood world is not confined to one valley. It imagines families crossing coasts, following rivers, and making homes where the land and sea met. Mizraim's descendants include peoples later associated with Egypt's surrounding regions. Canaan's descendants occupy the land that will eventually become the setting of Abraham's descendants. Long before Israel enters that land, Genesis places its peoples inside the common genealogy of Noah's house. Sidon appears as Canaan's firstborn, and Heth follows. The list continues through groups later encountered in the patriarchal narratives and the conquest traditions. The names establish that the biblical world is populated by neighboring peoples with deep roots, not by faceless crowds appearing only when conflict begins. The boundary of the Canaanites is described from Sidon toward Gaza and then towards Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim. Those locations foreshadow stories still ahead. Geography in Genesis often works this way. A line on the map quietly prepares the reader for a moral conflict that later breaks into view. Cush's line contains a break in the usual rhythm. After naming descendants, Genesis pauses over Nimrod. The pause signals a shift from the spread of clans to the rise of public power. A mighty hunter is memorable. The beginning of a kingdom is more consequential still. Nimrod's description, "before the Lord," can carry the sense of public notoriety in God's sight. Genesis neither praises him as a hero nor presents a courtroom accusation. It gives a title and follows it with cities. The narrative weight falls on the emergence of organized rule, not on a legend about one man. Babel heads the list of places where his kingdom began. Erech, Akkad, and Calneh stand beside it in Shinar. These names belong to the river plain of Mesopotamia, a setting where irrigation, farming, trade, and urban settlement could support populations far larger than a single household. Cities gather more than people. They gather grain, labor, craft, records, guards, shrines, and ambition. A city can protect the vulnerable and distribute work. It can also make one group's desire reach farther than any family could reach alone. Genesis will show the people of Shinar using that gathered capacity. The following cities include Nineveh, Calah, and Resen, names associated with Assyria's later power. Their appearance gives the genealogy a long horizon. Empires that later dominate Israel's story rise from the same post-flood human world. They are neither eternal nor outside God's moral concern. The table says that peoples spread after the flood, each according to family, language, land, and nation. The wording provides the result before Genesis narrates the decisive division at Babel. The narrative is concerned with meaning, not with satisfying every modern demand for a single linear chronology. The account of Babel brings the reader to the moment when one language enabled a collective refusal. The Nations chapter has already shown a world meant to spread outward. The plain of Shinar shows people trying to reverse that movement through a city designed to make departure unnecessary. Their migration from the east places them on a broad, fertile plain. A family moving across such ground could see what concentrated settlement offered: access to water, fields close by, shared labor, and protection. The choice to settle is understandable. The choice to make settlement defy God is the point of crisis. They spoke to one another before they built anything. "Come," they said, and the word repeats through their plan. Their unity begins in shared speech and mutual resolve. The account lets the builders state their own aim, so the judgment that follows does not rest on a motive imposed from outside. The coastland peoples named through Javan make the table larger than a landlocked genealogy. Their homes lie toward waters that connect distant shores. Traders, sailors, and settlers will carry languages across those routes. A command to fill the earth includes such movement, even when its details remain outside the frame of Genesis. The descendants of Aram lead toward regions east and north of Canaan. Their names will later appear around the patriarchs whose marriages and journeys unfold among Aramean relatives. The table plants these relationships early, before any covenant family begins to cross the map that Genesis has spread before the reader. Eber's two sons divide the line into Peleg and Joktan. Joktan's descendants are associated with places extending toward the south and east. The genealogy does not treat one household as the only meaningful one. It follows many branches, then returns to the branch required for the promise still waiting ahead. The word nation in this chapter does not require a modern state with fixed borders and institutions. It can describe a people bound by ancestry, land, and speech. That flexibility helps explain why the table can move from fathers to places to groups without losing the thread of human multiplication. The map also gives later biblical conflicts a human depth. Egypt, Canaan, Assyria, and distant coastlands do not enter the story as abstract powers. They arise in the same world that inherited Noah's covenant. Every nation will have its own decisions to make under the God who preserved the earth. Nimrod's cities reveal a further change in scale. Farmers can work a field around a household. Urban centers require stored food, coordinated labor, routes of exchange, and public authority. The beginning of a kingdom means that human strength can now be concentrated and directed by more than kinship alone. Shinar lies in the larger region, associated with southern Mesopotamia. Its plain supported dense settlement because rivers and canals could sustain agriculture. The setting gives the Babel story its material force. A large project there could draw many families together and make a common future feel physically achievable. Erech and Akkad stand with Babel as signs that the plain already held more than one settlement. The city and tower story is not about the invention of all urban life. It concerns a particular collective act formed by people who wanted one city to secure their name against the command to spread. Later traditions attach elaborate acts to Nimrod, including the claim that he personally ordered Babel's construction. Genesis does not make that claim. Its own association is narrower and sufficient for the story. Nimrod is mighty, his kingdom begins in several cities, and Babel stands first among them. The plain's attraction would have been plain to any family seeking permanence. Bricks could be made where stone was scarce. Bitumen could seal walls against weather. Labor could be divided. What begins as a practical settlement becomes spiritually dangerous when its builders decide that staying together must override God's purpose. Their slogan begins and ends with themselves. Let us make bricks. Let us build ourselves a city. Let us make a name for ourselves. The repetition is their own, not the narrator's invention. Their fear of scattering turns shared ability into a determination to be self-securing. The God who had told Noah's sons to fill the earth was not opposed to human community. Families, clans, and nations all belonged to the command. Shinar's offense was the will to turn one community into a shelter from obedience, a center where humanity could make its own direction final. The city names also give later readers a warning about scale. A city may begin with a legitimate need for shelter and exchange, then become a place where power is concentrated beyond the reach of any family. Genesis does not condemn walls or craft. It asks what purpose governs those gifts once many people depend on them. The phrase mighty hunter may sound distant from the tower, yet hunting concerns mastery over dangerous territory and public reputation. When the title is followed by the beginning of a kingdom, the narrative joins personal force to organized power. What one notable man can do becomes the pattern of a growing political center. Babel is thus named before its tower is described. The city exists within a network of urban beginnings before its builders speak together on the plain. The tower account does not fall from nowhere. It emerges from a world where cities, labor, and public authority have already begun to reshape human imagination. The list of nations has given every line a place in the post-flood world. Babel will briefly show humanity as one speaking people before speech is divided. The sequence holds both truths. People share one human origin, and their later languages and lands arise under God's judgment and providence. The builder's stated purpose contains no appeal to caring for the weak or honoring the covenant. Their words concern a city for themselves, a tower for their name, and protection from scattering. Genesis lets that motive stand in the open, where its fear and self-exaltation can be seen together. Common speech gave the builders an extraordinary ability to coordinate. Instructions could pass through a crowd without loss. Work could be measured, assigned, and repeated. The account recognizes the strength of communication before it shows how communication can be bent toward a purpose that opposes God's command. Their concern about being scattered shows that rebellion can wear the face of prudence. The desire for security is not strange. Families need shelter and companionship. The crisis comes when security becomes the highest good, and obedience is treated as a threat to be managed by human design. This is why Babel cannot be reduced to a warning against architecture. The issue is not height by itself, nor the use of brick, nor the existence of a city. The issue is a united people making their own permanence the answer to God's direction, then calling that refusal a name. The words spoken on the plain will soon meet a greater word from above. Human beings say, "Come, let us build." The Lord will say, "Come, let us go down." The contrast reveals whose purpose finally governs the earth that Noah's family had been commanded to fill. One family has become a map of peoples, yet the next question is darker. What happens when those peoples gather their strength in one place? If this account helps keep those questions open, Patreon makes room for exclusive companion studies and deeper investigations, while Buy Me a Coffee helps sustain the work. The links are quietly available in the pinned comment and description. The answer begins with the First Kingdom and the plain, where human unity turns against its purpose. Genesis chapter 10 opens the table of the nations through the sons of Noah. Japheth's line includes Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. Their descendants extend through coastal peoples and distant lands. The list gives no dramatic speeches because its drama lies in multiplication itself. From Javan come names associated with maritime regions and island peoples. The phrase coastland peoples allows the map to reach outward from the land of Israel toward the shores and trading routes of the wider Mediterranean world. The family released from one ark has become geography. Ham's line includes Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. Mizraim is the Hebrew name commonly used for Egypt. Canaan's descendants are linked with places that later stand inside Israel's story: Sidon, Heth, Jebusites, Amorites, Girgashites, Hivites, Archites, Sinites, Arvadites, Zemarites, and Hamathites. The table does not erase the future conflicts those names will carry. It establishes their shared place in the human family before those conflicts unfold. Peoples who later meet Israel as enemies or neighbors are not introduced as creatures from another origin. They belong within the same post-flood human map. Shem's descendants include Elam, Ashur, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. Through Arphaxad, the line moves toward Eber, a name connected with the Hebrews in later biblical usage. Eber has two sons, Peleg and Joktan. In Peleg's days, the earth was divided, a phrase Genesis will leave beside the Babel account. Joktan's line runs through a series of names that point toward the southern and eastern reaches of the map. The effect is cumulative. Families become clans, clans settle lands, lands carry languages. The command to fill the earth is becoming visible through ordinary generations rather than one royal decree. Traditional Jewish and Christian counting often speaks of 70 descendants in this chapter. The count depends on how names are numbered in the list, but the tradition catches something real about its design. Genesis presents a broad human horizon, a world of peoples related by descent and separated by place. The chapter repeatedly says, by their families, by their languages, in their lands, and by their nations. Genesis chapter 10 verse 31. The order matters. Identity is not reduced to blood alone. Family, speech, territory, and public life are all present in the world that grows after Noah. Among the names stands Nimrod, a descendant of Cush. He is called a mighty one on the earth and a mighty hunter before the Lord. The phrase does not provide a biography, but it marks him as a figure of unusual public force in a chapter filled mostly with family names. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. With that sentence, city building and kingdom making enter the post-flood map. The story has moved from households living under a covenant to power gathered in named centers. Genesis also associates his realm with Assyria, Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and Rezin. Translators differ over the precise movement of the sentence, yet the cluster of cities remains clear. A human world once reduced to 8 survivors now contains organized settlements whose names will echo through biblical history. Later traditions picture Nimrod as the builder of Babel, the enemy of Abraham, or the ruler who defied God in a detailed personal drama. Those stories belong to later interpretation. Genesis calls him a mighty hunter and places Babel at the beginning of his kingdom. It does not supply those later scenes. A kingdom changes the scale of human decisions. A household can sin inside one tent. A city can gather labor, tools, food, and memory behind walls. A kingdom can give ambition an organized body. The people of Shinar will soon reveal what such organization seeks when it has one speech and one shared fear. The Table of Nations already spoke of languages and lands. Then Genesis turns back to a moment when all the earth had one language and one speech. The account does not pause to reconcile the sequence for curiosity's sake. It brings the reader to the decisive human choice that explains dispersion. People journeyed from the east and found a plain in the land of Shinar. A plain offers room for fields, roads, and expansion. It also offers visibility. On an open plain, a city can become a center that draws scattered households inward, promising that no family needs to face the world alone. They said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." Brick served them as stone and bitumen as mortar. The detail is practical and local. In a region without abundant building stone, human skill turned earth and fire into durable material for a permanent structure. Their craft was real. The builders understood how to make a city stand. Scripture does not portray ignorance as their failure. Their danger emerges in the purpose they give their skill. Technical ability can serve cultivation, shelter, justice, and worship. It can also become the machinery of a single defiant will. "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens," they said. "Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." Genesis chapter 11, verse 4. Their stated fear was scattering. That fear stood directly against the command given after the flood: "Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth." A city was not automatically rebellion. Cities appear in the genealogy before Babel. The crisis came from a united project determined to resist the spreading God had assigned to humanity. Their desire to make a name also reached beyond a monument. A name can mean reputation, permanence, and a center strong enough to outlive the people who built it. The survivors of the flood had received a covenant from God. The builders of Shinar sought security through a collective work bearing their own name. Their unity had value only while it remained under God. In Shinar, unity became a shelter for defiance. The same human capacity that could join families into a people was being directed against the purpose that gave those families the earth in the first place. The tower's top in the heavens does not require a modern picture of people climbing to God's dwelling place. Ancient towers could be monumental religious structures, visible signs of a city's identity. The builders wanted a center that would hold them together against the future they feared. Their brickwork and mortar were enough for a city. They were never enough to secure the future on their own terms. The next movement turns upward, where the scale of the tower will be measured by the one it was meant to answer. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. The sentence carries a quiet irony. Human beings spoke of a tower reaching into the heavens. God came down to inspect what they had raised from the plain. He said, "Indeed, the people are one and they all have one language, and this is what they begin to do." Their shared speech had made coordinated action possible. The concern is not that language itself was evil. The concern was a united rebellion gaining momentum without a boundary. God confused their language so that they could no longer understand one another's speech. Work that depends on shared instructions stopped. Plans could not travel from mind to hand with the same certainty. The city remained unfinished because the people who built it could no longer turn one purpose into one coordinated act. The place came to be called Babel because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. The Hebrew wordplay links Babel with confusion. The name holds together a city's ambition and the fracture of speech that ended its attempt to become the world's unbroken center. From there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. The builders had named scattering as the fate they most wished to avoid. It became the form of judgment that also carried out the command they had resisted. Humanity was preserved, but its organized defiance was interrupted. This judgment differed from the flood in a crucial way. Water had swept away a world saturated with violence. At Babel, God restrained a new rebellion before it could harden into one total human order. The people remained alive. They would build homes, form communities, and speak new languages across the earth. The dispersion was painful because every separation is painful. Families found themselves unable to continue as before, yet it also prevented one city and one public name from claiming the place that belonged to God. The earth would be filled by peoples, not held beneath one self-made center. The ark had gathered life into one enclosed space because judgment was falling. Babel tried to gather life into one center because human beings feared the future. One gathering preserved life under God's command. The other gathered strength against the command to spread. Babel was not the recovery of humanity after the flood. It was the first attempt to make survival sufficient without submission. The disaster of the old world had been remembered, yet memory alone had not taught the builders how to trust the God who had preserved them. Genesis does not end the Babel account with a map of ruined bricks. It narrows to the family of Shem. That turn matters because the scattered nations need more than an explanation for their division. They need a path through which blessing can reach them without recreating Babel's false unity. Shem's line runs through Arphaxad, Shelah, Eber, Peleg, Roi, Serug, Nahor, Terah, and Abram. The names move with a steady rhythm after the upheaval on the plain. While nations spread across the earth, one household is being traced through generations toward a call that will answer the nation's deepest need. Peleg's name remains beside the statement that the earth was divided in his days. Genesis does not make the name a puzzle to be solved apart from its family line. It keeps division and descent close together, as though the scattering of peoples and the preservation of a promise must be read in one frame. Terah lived in Ur of the Chaldeans and became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran fathered Lot and died in his native land. Grief enters the genealogy before the larger journey begins. Even the line that will bear blessing moves through ordinary loss, marriage, departure, and unfinished plans. Terah took Abram, Sarai, and Lot and set out from Ur toward Canaan. They came to Haran and settled there. The journey stopped before its intended destination, leaving the family between the land it had known and the land toward which it had begun to move. The next chapter will bring God's call to Abram. Leave country and kindred, go to the land he will show, and become a blessing through whom all families of the earth will be blessed. The words reach back across Babel. God does not erase the nations in order to bless them. He begins with one household, not one empire. He gives a promise, not a tower. He calls a man to leave a settled place, not to gather the whole world under a city. The path toward blessing begins with trust that moves outward under God's word. The post-flood world was therefore more than a list of events between judgment and Abraham. It was the making of the stage on which Abraham's call could be heard. Covenant, blood, household failure, families, nations, kingdoms, Shinar and Babel all formed the world from which that call emerged. The builders did not need to be primitive in order to be wrong. Their knowledge of baked brick showed patience, planning, and control of fire. Their use of bitumen showed an ability to bind materials into a durable wall. Genesis takes their capability seriously, which makes the moral direction of that capability impossible to ignore. The tower belonged inside a city. A city gathers identity around a visible center, and a tower can give that center religious and political weight. The builders wanted more than shelter from weather. They wanted a name that would make their unity permanent and make dispersion look like failure. Their stated fear explains the force of their decision. To be scattered meant leaving the familiar crowd, losing a common tongue, and facing the uncertainty of distant ground. The command to fill the earth required trust, precisely where fear made consolidation attractive. The Lord's descent answers the builders with irony rather than spectacle. A structure they described in relation to heaven had to be inspected from above. The contrast does not mock human work itself. It exposes the distance between a human monument and the authority of the God whose purpose it resisted. God's words recognize the strength of human cooperation. One people with one language could begin a project and carry it forward quickly. The judgment responds before their common purpose grows into a settled pattern that treats collective will as its own final authority. Confused speech interrupts the smallest acts of construction. A worker cannot receive instruction. A plan cannot move cleanly from one group to another. A city built by coordinated labor loses the coordination it needs. The unfinished work becomes visible evidence that human unity is not self-sustaining. The people are scattered across the face of the earth, the very outcome their declaration had rejected. Their dispersion is not presented as a random accident of migration. It is God's answer to a city that tried to turn fear into an alternative order for humanity. That answer also preserves the people who receive it. The flood had dealt with a world filled with violence. Babel receives a boundary that breaks its unified rebellion, while allowing households and nations to continue. Judgment is real, yet mercy still governs the history that follows. Languages are therefore part of the post-Babel world described in Genesis. They carry the difficulty and richness of human difference. The story does not tell people to despise that difference. It shows why no one language, city, and name may claim the whole earth as its private monument. The Table of Nations and the Babel account belong together. One shows peoples distributed according to families, lands, and languages. The other shows why the builder's dream of preventing that distribution could not stand. Diversity in the narrative grows inside God's larger purpose for the earth. The city of Babel was left unfinished, but the desire it revealed did not disappear from human history. Later, kingdoms would make names, raise walls, gather armies, and claim lasting glory. Genesis places Babel early so that every later empire can be measured against the same question of submission. The next genealogy answers that question through apparent smallness. After the plain full of brickmakers and the drama of divided speech, Genesis returns to fathers and sons. The shift is deliberate. God's answer to a proud public project begins through a line of households, not an opposing monument. Arphaxad fathers Shelah, Shelah fathers Eber, and Eber fathers Peleg. The generations pass without the public language of Babel, but they are not empty. Each name carries the promise forward through time. The story of blessing must survive in families before it reaches nations. Peleg's name is placed beside the statement that the earth was divided in his days. Genesis leaves the phrase close to the larger account of division without turning it into a secret code. The name keeps the memory of scattering within the genealogy that leads toward Abram. Ru, Serug, Nahor, and Terah follow. The sequence resists the glamour of empire. Nothing in it resembles a tower, a royal title, or a public boast. God's redemptive work advances through births, marriages, deaths, and journeys that could look ordinary until the promise gives them their meaning. Terah's household lived in Ur of the Chaldeans. Ur was a settled place, with inherited gods and familiar roots. When Terah left with Abram, Sarai, and Lot toward Canaan, the movement already contrasted with Babel. One project tried to prevent scattering. This family began moving under a future it had not mastered. They reached Haran and settled there. The journey toward Canaan paused, and Terah died in Haran. Genesis allows the road to contain delay and grief. The line of promise does not travel through a world freed from loss. It travels through the same human frailty visible since Noah's tent. Abram will receive the call to leave his country, his kindred, and his father's house. The command reverses Babel's instinct without simply celebrating isolation. God sends one man away from settled security so that blessing may eventually reach all the families of the earth. The promise to Abram does not replace the nations with one favored people. It speaks of blessing for every family of the earth. The nations scattered at Babel remain within God's concern. Their division becomes the setting in which a promise can travel outward without becoming another self-made center. This is the deep shape of the world Noah helped rebuild. The covenant protects creation. The command fills the earth. The prohibition around blood guards human life. The household reveals sin's persistence. The nations spread, and Babel exposes the temptation to make human unity a substitute for trust. Noah's altar stands at the beginning of that shape. It says that the first response to preservation is worship. The rainbow stands above it, declaring that seasons will continue by God's mercy. Babel stands later on the plain, showing what happens when human beings receive stability yet seek their final security in themselves. The flood had shown what violence could do when it filled the earth. Babel showed a different danger: coordinated pride, protected by shared skill and a shared public name. The forms differ, but both treat God's world as material for a human order that refuses his authority. Noah's covenant did not promise that every society would remain righteous. It promised that the earth's regular seasons would continue and that waters would not again destroy all flesh. That stable mercy created room for history, including the freedom by which people could build altars or towers. The command concerning blood belongs beside Babel as well. A city that makes its own name supreme can eventually treat human beings as bricks in its larger project. God had already declared that every human life bears his image. No collective ambition can erase that claim. The dispersion at Babel leaves peoples in distinct lands, but it does not abandon them to chaos. They remain under the covenant made with all flesh. Rain still falls over every language. Seed time returns for every household. The rainbow belongs above nations that cannot understand one another's speech. The genealogy from Shem to Terah moves through a quieter kind of faithfulness. Names are remembered because God's purpose travels through time. A world of empires can make one ruler famous in a generation. A promise may move more slowly, carried through fathers who never see its final reach. Abram's coming call will require him to leave a place where family, name, and security are already established. His obedience will not be an escape from the nations. It will become the beginning of a blessing aimed at their restoration, reaching toward every family scattered after Babel. The contrast is sharp without being simplistic. Babel gathers people to make one human name endure. Abram will receive a name from God and then be sent onward. The tower seeks permanence through control. The promise creates a future through trust, movement, and a blessing that cannot be manufactured. Terah's stop in Haran proves that even a family moving toward Canaan does not control every stage of its journey. Death, delay, and unfinished plans accompany it. God's purpose is not a machine driven by human momentum. It continues through weakness that no tower could have eliminated. The route from Ararat to Babel therefore has a moral shape. The land was given back. Life was guarded. Households multiplied. Nations found their places. When people tried to turn their shared power into final security, God broke the project open and set history moving again. The route from Babel to Abram has a redemptive shape. Division is followed by a lineage. A lineage is followed by a journey. A journey is followed by a promise for the families of the earth. God answers proud human consolidation through a blessing that travels by faith instead of force. Noah's altar and Babel's tower stand at opposite ends of the story. One rises from gratitude after mercy has preserved life. The other rises from fear after mercy has provided a stable world. The difference lies in the direction of the heart that builds. The descendants of Noah inherit the memory of judgment, but memory does not save them. They need the God who spoke after the flood. Every generation will face the same choice in its own form. Receive life as a gift under his command, or use his gifts to create a name that excludes him. The rainbow teaches that creation's future rests on God's word. Babel teaches that a stable creation can still become the setting for rebellion. The same seasons that let families plant and harvest also give builders time to organize an ambition. Mercy is never a license to forget the one who grants it. Noah's household had received a command to multiply and fill the earth. The nations table shows that command taking historical form. Babel stands as the resistance within that fulfillment, a moment when human beings try to halt the outward movement and make one location the guarantee of their future. God's answer does not turn the earth back into emptiness. He does not close another ark door or cover the plain with water. He breaks the unity of speech and sends people outward. The judgment protects the larger command, preserving a future in which many peoples can inhabit the earth. This makes dispersion more than an ending. It becomes a road. Different languages, lands, and nations will create distance, misunderstanding, and conflict. Yet they also form the human field toward which the blessing promised through Abram will eventually move, not by erasing peoples, but by reaching them. The genealogy after Babel refuses the idea that God's purpose was defeated by division. A line remains, names continue. Terah's house takes a first step toward Canaan. The promise advances quietly through history while the great centers of human power rise and fall around it. Abram's later faith will be tested by the same question that haunted Shinar. Where does safety come from? He will be asked to leave a settled land without building a tower to secure his name. His future will depend on the God who speaks, guides, and makes a blessing where no human plan could create one. The world made after the flood had room for cities, nations, languages, vineyards, altars, and journeys. Its problem was never that people organized their lives. Its problem emerged whenever organization became self-worship and human beings placed their own name above the covenant that had preserved them. The story therefore reaches beyond ancient Mesopotamia. Every structure that promises permanent safety can become a Babel when it asks people to trust the structure more than God. Every crowd can become a substitute for obedience when belonging matters more than the purpose for which human beings were made. The ark door had once closed around 8 lives while the old world fell under the waters. When it opened, mercy gave them land, seasons, food, children, and a command. The years that followed showed that none of those gifts could remove the old temptation to secure life without submission. Noah built an altar before he planted a future. God placed the bow in the cloud before nations possessed territory. Blood was guarded before governments formed. These foundations taught that rebuilding depended on covenant and reverence, not merely on stronger houses, fuller granaries, or a larger population. The shame in Noah's tent exposed the fault line early. A family could survive judgment and still misuse another person's weakness. Shem and Japheth covered what Ham carried outward. The future nations would descend from a household where honor and dishonor had already shown their different consequences. The table of nations then widened the frame. Peoples, languages, lands, and families spread across the earth as God had commanded. Their distinctions were not a mistake in the story. They were part of the human world after the ark, a world meant to be filled through many households under one creator. Babel turned those gifts into a different project. Shared language became a tool for refusing dispersion. Skill in brick and mortar became a means of building permanent self-security. The builders wanted a name that could hold them against the very future God had assigned to them. God came down to the tower and divided their speech. He did not drown them as he had drowned the violent world before Noah. He set a boundary around a rebellion that was gathering force. The scattered peoples would remain, and through them the earth would be filled. That boundary leads directly to Abram. From Shem's line, God calls one man away from his own settled world and promises blessing for all the families Babel had scattered. The answer to human pride is not a better tower. It is a promise received in faith and carried into the nations. The closed ark door means more after Babel than it did on Ararat. It held 8 people against judgment, but the world outside required more than survival. It required covenant, reverence for life, stewardship spread across the earth, and hearts willing to receive God's direction rather than manufacture their own security. Every age knows the pressure to find safety in a name, a crowd, or a structure strong enough to make fear feel manageable. Babel shows where that pressure leads when it becomes the center of human purpose. Mercy opens a door, then obedience decides what will be built outside it. What does the closed ark door mean to you after Babel? Write it in the comments. And if the story has brought you to the place where a human name cannot save the soul, write this surrender with faith. Lord Jesus, I belong to you. You alone are the Savior of my soul. Mercy opens the door. Obedience decides what is built outside.